Welcome to Leadership Bites with myself, your host, Guy Bloom. This is a leadership podcast where I have conversations with colleagues, I chat with guests, and sometimes there'll be just me talking. You can connect with me at livingbrave.com, and when you enjoy the episode, subscribe and please tell everyone. Rob, absolutely brilliant to have you on this episode of Leadership Bites. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
Well, I'm really pleased that you are. I've got a list of things that I want to ask you and talk about. Sure. But just before we move forward, I always say at the start, I know who you are. Others may not. So please just introduce yourself and let people know who you are.
Okay. So my name is Rob Briner and I'm Professor of Organisational Psychology at Queen Mary University of London. I also have a couple of other visiting professorships elsewhere. And I also helped to set up around 10 years ago something called the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, which was trying to promote evidence-based practice within the field of management. And I have a long-standing interest, I suppose, in helping practitioners make better use of evidence and information and data in their decision-making.
Okay. So, again, lots of things I want to talk to you about in this space. I always have a belief that understanding how somebody got into the position they're in can sometimes help me contextualize their information and maybe give it, more oomph, as one might say. So just give me a sense of, how did Rob get to be a professor of organizational psychology?
So I guess when my memory is, and obviously memory is very kind of faulty in lots of ways, but my memory is I was quite interested in psychology and philosophy when I was doing my kind of A-levels, and I went on to do a degree in that. And I got very interested in doing research. So the typical things you do as a student, writing essays, that kind of stuff I didn't really enjoy very much, having to read lots of stuff and quite enjoy that kind of stuff. But what I really enjoyed doing is the research. So I think that led me naturally to thinking after a degree, to a master's degree, to a PhD at Sheffield University, at something called the Institute of Work Psychology. And I got into very interesting research method, producing research. And as time went on, what I discovered was that the kind of scientific research myself and my colleagues were producing was just not being used by practitioners. So I taught a lot of masters in organizational psychology students. I'd see them a few years later at a conference or an event. I say, hey, how's it going? Are you using all this stuff you taught on the course? And most it's like, well, no, we're not. And for years and years and years, I kind of felt it was their fault. As in, weren't you using this? Look, here's all this great science. Here, just take this science and use it. Come on, what is wrong with you? And I think over time, I just regard it now just completely wrong. It is not their fault. It is actually to do all kinds of things like the quality of the evidence we produce, the fact that scientific evidence is never enough. You need other kinds of evidence as well. And also, frankly, some of it is just not practically relevant either. So although academics feel that produce, even in applied fields like management or HR or leadership development or organizational psychology, even though people feel as academics, this stuff is relevant, well, maybe it just isn't. It's not addressing the concerns practitioners, decision makers have on the ground. Maybe nice research, whatever, but it's not always so relevant. So from that, I then just got much more interested in, I guess rather than just producing research, being interested in how people use it and how we can improve its use, how we can make research, I guess, more relevant to practice.
That's of real interest to me because I'm 52 years old now, and so I have a career, as one does, and I used to offer great stuff to people.
Yes.
Developing them and training them, and of course, some of it stuck and some of it didn't. So why doesn't it all stick if it's all awesome? And of course, the answer is, well, because I think it's awesome doesn't mean anything. And somebody said to me, communication is the response that you get, not the one that you want.
Mm-hmm.
And that really struck with me as, it doesn't really matter how great I think it is. It's like creating a product, isn't it? If people aren't buying it, then it's, then what's its value? So I'm hearing that, I think, in what you're saying.
And it's who's the product for? And I think one of the interesting things about research and science in general is you could argue, well, maybe all this academic scientific research is for other researchers, but it actually isn't. It doesn't seem to be either. Most academic papers are not cited very much by any other researchers. So it begs the question, well, who is this stuff really for? And one answer to that is it's about helping people have careers. It's because people are interested in it. Of course, sometimes it's useful. So you could, back to your point, you could say, well, the audience for this is not a manager, the audience for this is a colleague. Well, it is, but it's only a handful of colleagues very often because we get more and more and more specialized. So even in my field, if I move slightly outside my fields, which are quite narrow, I actually, I don't know the literature, I don't know the stuff, I don't understand it, or I can understand it, it takes me a while. So you have to a lot of people, not just me, are saying, what is this academic, what's this scientific research for? What is its purpose? What is it achieving? Who is, back to your point, who's the audience for this? And that's a really important question.
It is. And I wonder, I sometimes read a white paper that's been written from this space.
Sure.
There's almost an over-validation sometimes in these documents that is, who's my audience? And I'd always thought, what, why can't there just be almost two versions of an academic? One is, for my academic friends and colleagues, and almost the so what version, which is, and, for those, I'm not wording it in a patronizing way, but for everybody else, here's why it's important. This is how you can make use of it. It's always an interesting kind of thing to think of.
And that's the kind of translational thing. And there's two issues there. One is that some of it maybe doesn't have any practical application. And I think that's okay. You may say it's more basic science, which is fine as well. But for that stuff that is potentially translatable, what universities and academics and researchers might say is that's not my job. It is not my job to translate this for a different kind of user. My users are my academic colleagues all around the world. It's not a manager sitting in an office somewhere in the middle of London. And there's a real challenge in our field. Who is responsible for doing this? Academics on the whole say, it's not us, we're not paid for this, but then whose responsibility is it? And I think that's partly why in business and management, there's a big gap here, which is filled possibly by white papers, possibly by consultancies, possibly by best-selling popular management books, because there is nobody really trying to make that translation, with a very few exceptions of some people that are. The other challenge is that you can be, I would say it helps to be a successful academic if you've never set foot inside an organization apart from university. In other words, even in very applied fields, you can be an incredibly successful researcher, an academic, a professor, and actually know nothing about practice, or very, very little. Hence, asking an academic to say, what are the implications for practice? What do I do with it? They just may not be able to do it because they're not a practitioner. They've never been a manager, they've never been they've never done management development. They know what it is. I mean, they've researched it, but they've never done it. So it's hard for them to translate. But I think that is a real issue. Whose job, whose role is it to do it? Yeah.
And you do see rock stars coming through, usually in the science space, that make those translations for people, and they write something accessible. All of a sudden, this person becomes, and people love it though, don't they? They want it. They want the complexity in a form that they can actually make sense of.
That's what they do, and that's a big challenge. And a big critique of that is that some of these rock stars, kind of some of the TEDx sort of stuff, is you use the word translation. Other people would look at it and go, I'm not sure this is a translation. This is somebody, an academic, a scientist, a researcher, making the points they want to make, and they're cherry picking bits of science to support that point of view. In my view, in my experience, a lot of that stuff isn't translational. It's people trying to write an exciting, interesting book that appeals to people, which is it's fine, but that's a different thing. It's not translation. It's telling a nice story. It's appealing.
So we will get onto it, but we did talk about trust actually, and about how that.
Yes, very important.
We'll probably come back to that. I think I'd like to loop back round to that. Now, of course, when people hear scientific evidence in the workplace, evidence-based management, having run programs over the last few decades, working with HR community and trying to evidence change. There's the old adage, it's like trying to knock a nail into jelly, right? It's because there are so many variables, that are going on at the same time. We've got that compensation thing that we're launching. We're doing this best practice in the workplace. Then we've got this leadership development thing that's going on as well. So which bit did your bit do? Yeah. It's very different to maybe sales training, where you can go, well, we did it on Monday and things got better on Tuesday.
Sure.
So that sort of bring a little bit to life what in your mind, when somebody says with great confidence, yes, scientific-based, evidence-based, yes, training, I get it fully. Which part of your brain goes, well, let's just see if you do?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain key phrases that people use, things like science shows, we know from science, those kind of expressions are very, very questionable and always.
I've got to pause you for 1 second because
yeah.
I wrote a LinkedIn quote that said, using the word neuroscience does not validate your argument.
Yes. Exactly.
Which is what
or the brain or neuroscience, having a picture of a brain with the sort of left and right hemispheres with arrows pointing in it. And I think there's a lot of overconfidence around science in general. And also words like proof and truth. So one of the things I always do in my sort of teaching and training is trying to say to people, being an evidence-based practitioner, we are not after the truth. We're not after proof. Truth is something to me kind of aesthetic and meaningful. Truth could be in a bowl of pasta, a beautiful sunrise, whatever it's that. Truth is not in a database. Truth is not in an experiment. Similar with proof. Science doesn't prove. Science gives you a sense of probabilities and likelihoods. So we're not after proof. And in a sense, all we're trying to do is make a better informed decision. We're trying to make a better informed decision that we're more likely to get the outcome we want than if we didn't use that data and information evidence. But in a sense, setting the bar so high, proof and truth, often puts people off. And they think, oh, you can never do that anyway. So I think it's not, if anything, I would say evidence-based practice is not about increasing your confidence. It's about reducing your lack of confidence. It's giving you more certainty, but it's not making you necessarily absolutely sure about it.
So for me, just to check in with you there, truth is relatively subjective. Is that what I'm hearing from you? You know, I find that good. I find that a beautiful thing. I don't.
Yeah.
You know, I think that was a good answer. I don't. You know, is that when you hear somebody's truth? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I think it's subjective, but also I don't think it's helpful to feel you need that to take action. Similarly, you don't need proof. So you may have some data, some information, some evidence that makes a decision. Sure, that data you've got is not perfect. It's going to be flawed. It's going to be biased. But the question you ask yourself is not necessarily how good is that data or evidence, so that's important. The question is trying to use it and being critical of its quality and thinking about how it's relevant. Are you more likely to make a better decision using it or not? So people are overly focused on single bits of information or data. Is it true? Is it not true? Yes, you have to think about that. But unless it's a maths problem or a crossword puzzle, you just gave a great example. Most of the things you've done, I guess, in your career, there isn't an answer. It just isn't. It's not. You're not doing a crossword puzzle. It's not a piece of algebra. There isn't an answer. So lots of things we do, you're right, are taking place in a complex set of the things. They have all kinds of problems. So in a sense, I think thinking about it as making a better informed decision is much more important.
That makes sense. So the more robust my belief in, or our shared belief in, is in the data, our opinions might be different, our truths might be different. So I've got a 9-year-old that said, I'd like to go down to the shop at the bottom of the road. And there's a part of me that goes, well, if you do, you might get kidnapped. There's another part of me that goes, well, of course, he's got to grow up and have some real life experiences, so he's not mollycoddled. Well, both things are true, right?
Yeah.
But I have to, as the inverted commas senior manager in this relationship, I have to make a decision that I will then live with. But what does the data tell me the likelihood of his safety? You know,
exactly.
So
Yes.
Yeah. The more I can hold to be true, the more likely I am to make a better decision. If I'm hearing,
and also that's a great example because it illustrates as well. There's always costs and benefits. So if you read some, popular management books or certain techniques that everyone's raving about and they think are wonderful, they often, in fact, one of the definitions of a management fad is often there's no downsides discussed. Do this thing, whatever it is, agile, whatever it happens to be, do this thing. And it's just wonderful. Well, as far as I'm aware, almost by definition, any intervention which has an effect can also have a negative effect. So there's always downsides, there's always cost and benefits. There's not just a lovely array of positive outcomes. It just doesn't seem to work like that to me. So again, thinking about the cost benefits is a key part of it. Yeah.
And I notice this a lot in sports. I've been in sports for most of my life. And what you realize is that the people that get good are the ones that have a constant forward momentum, and they have a very balanced relationship with succeeding and failing. Because they constantly, when they're training and practicing, they're constantly succeeding and constantly failing.
Yeah.
because they're constantly trying.
And I think, exactly. And you see this quite a lot, even as you use a very specific example, it's not sports and more the workplace. When we think of people's performance at work, we often say, well, Guy's a better performer than Rob, and Rob's not slightly better than this person. And actually, as you just said, a lot of performance is actually dynamic. In other words, some days you might do quite well, some days you don't, some months you might, some years you might. And so it's not a sort of static in-between person, some people better or not. And it's about that kind of process. But it's a good example of the way we think about an outcome like performance, and we tend to just say it's just going up or it's going down, that's it. And of course, typically it's much more dynamic than, and that's exactly the kind of complexity, the kind of thinking that needs to go into making a more evidence-based decision.
So what's a working week, month for you, Rob, that sees you bringing this into people's thinking, and how do you manifest that intellectualization into something that's tangible for people?
So I do it through teaching, and the challenge in that is teaching evidence-based management is obviously better if you've got people who are actually managing, or have got experience managing. Some of the students I teach have, and historically, like I worked at Birkbeck for 20 years, and they're all part-time mature students. So all those students had that. Some of the students I have now. So I do it partly through that. But I think even if you can't teach the whole of what evidence-based practice management might mean, I think what you can do with students at any level is you can make them think critically about the quality of information and data and evidence. So you gave the example earlier of white papers. So it's making them think, where is this published? Who published it? What is the claim being made about this piece of research? What in principle would provide really strong evidence, what would provide weak evidence, what would be very questionable evidence, and even just to get them to think about different kinds of information and data and how trustworthy they are is one way of doing it, again, with people who actually don't have any particular management experience. And I use examples of things like, TripAdvisor. So if you're choosing a restaurant, which most students can relate to, I think, how would you choose it? Do you trust TripAdvisor? And we get into interesting arguments about, well, you believe it? Do you not believe it? Do people pay for reviews? Can you trust the reviews? So it's just the idea of thinking, here's some information. This is what the claim is. How can we find out how likely it is to be true or accurate in some way? So you can do that with undergraduates as well as other kinds of students. I do that in universities. I do training as well and coaching for teams and organizations around evidence-based practice. That involves kind of awareness things, but also involves following them over time on projects. And I'm also trying to be quite active on things like Twitter and LinkedIn, partly promoting different pieces of research, not necessarily as good, but that might be informative in some way, but also to challenge sometimes, I guess, some of the myths around certain management practices that seem to be very popular. And again, the point of evidence-based practice is not to say, oh, this stuff's rubbish, but actually there is a lot of stuff that doesn't seem to be very effective. And that really gets in the way of people focusing on what might be more effective. So a great example is something like the MBTI, which causes a lot of debate.
I'm so glad you said that.
A lot of debate, is it good, is it not? And of course, what's interesting about the MBTI, as a nice example, is that actually, in terms of the, if you like, the academic views, that psychometrically, it's not very good compared to other measures.
The big five, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. They're actually free to use as well. On the other hand, what practitioners say is, I find it useful. I like it. My clients like it. It's a great tool for me to use. Okay. Behind that is a claim, isn't it? That this is working, this is doing something. And of course, the question is it? And of course, every practitioner feels it is, but every practitioner, every field, probably feels what they do is working. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't do it unless they're a charlatan in some way. So we all feel what we're doing is working. That's fine, but maybe you need other kinds of evidence. It's not just about your view or your opinion.
So I'm very intrigued by people that utilize any tool, any piece of evidence as a finite tool to be a catalyst for a conversation or to trigger some deeper thinking. Or look, the evidence would indicate, as far as I understand it, that this is true. And there's a difference between talking in world truths and absolutes, i.e., I've read the data, therefore I'm right, versus listen, to the best of my understanding, this is what I've been reading. Yeah. It'd be great for you to have a conversation. And then there are people that are using it to catalyze and to create and to innovate conversation. And then there are those that I think use any form of data or information, or, well, they talk through a book or an author. And I know people that will never offer their own opinion. They go, well, according to Bob Smith, or, well, of course, when you read the work of Jan Pokey Pokey, and you go, great, so what do you think? Well, that's a very good question. And if you think about what Simon Banana says,
argument by citation, as it's known. Yeah,
is that what it's called? Because
it means that you're not making an argument. You're just saying this person says this person says that. What do you think? It's actually, but what's the argument? Yes, you're telling me these people think this, these people think this, but what's the argument you're making?
Yes.
So even though it's just citing lots of information, and I think it's so the
citation, isn't it? It's almost, I can't validate my own opinion, but I can become valid by utilizing somebody else. Yes. That's what I feel that happens a lot.
Sure, it does. And it's interesting, the MBTI catalyst in catalyst conversation. So again, what I would say, I think what I would feel is, okay, you're saying the MBTI starts conversation. Fine. Why is starting a conversation a good idea? Why is that a good idea? Are all conversations good? Are they bad? Or what kind of conversation? Why is this tool helping you start this kind of conversation, which you say is better than that kind of conversation? Is there a better, easier, and cheaper way of starting a conversation than going through this whole MBTI thing? So it's like peeling it back to say, okay, your claim is this helps you start a conversation. I'm sure it does, but then why is that good? Why is it good to have a conversation? It could be terrible. It could be neutral. It could be what kind of conversation, to what ends, to what purpose. So I think unpacking the logic of those interventions is also very important. Even if you say it's psychometric and not sound, fine. It may have other beneficial effects, but what are they? And are they better than doing something else, or worse, or same, or what do we know about that?
I think I see that a lot, where people have a belief in a process that is being almost sold to them. It's like performance management. Yeah. People go, we're not very good at doing performance management here, so we're going to spend £1 million on this system. And I go, well, I'm pretty sure there'll be quite a few examples, if you look at it, of very expensive systems that are laying dormant and are not being utilized. Yeah. It's, what do you want it to do? And actually, what you might want to say is, if people believe in performance management and really buy into it, even if they're using the back of a pad and a scrap of paper, they'll make it work, even if they wish there was a better process. So why don't you make it work first? And then when you've got it working, then invest in an expensive system. Yeah. It's almost, and I think there's a lot of people that look to buy an answer. They want to, the validation, and particularly people in the HR space, I think, they want to validate upwards, and they don't feel they have a parity of opinion with somebody that's senior. They almost over-educate themselves, I think, sometimes, to be valid. I am so well certified. I'm so well qualified. But actually, they haven't formed their own confidence of holding space on an opinion. So I hear that what you're doing is going, it's all lovely. It's all potentially useful. But you're asking the person to develop their thinking and their mind to grow, to the level that they're offering maybe the data.
Yeah, it's to develop their thinking and their critical thinking, but also to develop that along with the use of evidence. The most important, what you just got up there, is what is the problem or opportunity you're trying to deal with? And to me, if there's one thing that helps people be more evidence-based, I think, is to spend more time thinking and analysing what the problem or opportunity is. Because as you said, often people buy in a system, a process, a technique, when they don't really know what the issue is. And then you get this thing called solutioneering, where you define a problem in relation to the solution you've already decided you want. So, for example, indeed, you may buy a very sort of sophisticated performance management system, but what's the performance management issue or problem or opportunity you're dealing with? And typically, in my experience, people don't know. There's some vague ideas, but rather than say what are our challenges, what are opportunities around performance, what is actually going on, let's spend 5 minutes thinking about this, and a lot of time procuring this huge expensive system, training people how to use it, often irritating the hell out of them in using it and so forth. But still, we don't know what the issue is you're trying to fix. And I think it's very hard, because the argument is that sitting around talking, thinking about what the issue is, that is cognitively hard work. It's very easy to all sit around and go, great, let's do this, let's plan, let's roll things out. HR loves rolling things out. And it's very good at it. What it's not so good, and not just HR, we're not saying what is the issue or problem we're trying to deal with. That's hard, and it's boring, and it can cause conflict between people, and it's just very challenging. Whereas rolling things out, yeah, it's got its challenges, but it's very fun and doable and achievable and clear. Whereas, diagnosing, understanding is hard.
And it's not action orientated. I mean, it is, but it's not in a manner
it feels
that seems valid. We're talking about it. Well, can't you just get it done? And I think my example there is around something like feedback. Most people have got a feedback model. Even if it's whatever it is, you can Google it. There you go. Boom. There's normally only 3 or 4 steps to giving somebody feedback. Doesn't matter which one, right? So why aren't you doing it? So not the tool that's the issue. It's your frame of reference, or your confidence, or your lack of bravery, so you're looking at that almost root cause. You're kind of saying, let's go beneath the surface and bring some challenge and some thinking to the factors that are in essence maybe creating this. And if we're going to use this information, let's look below just what it's offering us, and be sure that what it's offering us actually is coming from a place of some robustness and some thinking.
And it's interesting. Sometimes when I'm doing training, say it's a one-day thing, I say that this morning, with a specific organisation, this morning we're just going to identify the 2 or 3 biggest challenges or opportunities that you're experiencing, say around people management, HR, whatever. We're just going to talk about how much we know and what we know about the problems or opportunities, and we're not going to discuss any solutions or interventions until this afternoon. I'm sure you can guess what happens. Within, say, 10 minutes, people are onto solutions.
Yeah.
They're onto fixing it. But what is the challenge? What is the problem? What is going on? And I think and again, I won't blame individuals. I think it's very human, because it is harder work. But also, I think it comes down to how we're rewarded. My sense is most of us, including academics, are rewarded for doing stuff, not how useful, effective, relevant that stuff is. We're rewarded for doing stuff. So typical annual appraisal might be, did you do this? Did you roll that out? Did you hit these targets? Great. Have a bonus, have a promotion, whatever it is. Was any of that stuff relevant to the business? Did it actually help? What was the issue it was trying to address? So again, we're incentivized to actually just do stuff. And again, I've literally had these conversations. Managers will say, this is all well and good, and I'd love to sit around thinking about stuff. I'd love to understand the problem, but I don't have time. I've got to do stuff. And that is a fundamental, I think, tension and paradox of evidence-based practice in any field at all. The people do stuff, they want to do stuff, they're reinforced, they're incentivized to do stuff. They're not incentivized to ask other questions. What is the problem? What's the issue? How do we know? And often doing stuff is not helpful. It may be unhelpful. So it's again, it's not. I'm certainly not blaming individuals, organisations. I think it's much more systemic, for want of a better word.
And there's something here about the relationship with craft, and it's a word I use quite a lot, because I'm if I'm going to run a program and whatever it is, just such as yourself, if you're not buying into it being a craft, then really you're going to attend. Right. If you buy into it as a craft, then you're going to have to do the tricky bit of craft, which is to practice and to fail, and to review and to calibrate and to et cetera, et cetera. And it's that willingness to kind of see it as something that requires a loop of reflection, trial, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So that's really interesting. You did mention to me, before we started recording, evidence-based practice is per se simple in practice, but more complex in actual application. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, as to why you said that.
Sure. I think firstly, evidence-based is a terrible term. It doesn't really communicate very well what it's about. So I think evidence-informed or information-informed would be better. There's something about evidence that always sounds like it's got a capital E, or is all capits in bold. Evidence, as though it's unquestionable and true and pure. And of course, it's not really about that. So the word is terrible, which doesn't help at all. And I think when you talk to people about evidence-based practice, they kind of sometimes shrug and they say, but I'm already using evidence. I always use evidence. You go, yeah, you do. You do always use evidence. And I think it's very hard to communicate the differences between what we usually do, because we do always use evidence and evidence-based practice. And recently I've kind of begun to think there's sort of just three main differences, which I'll go over briefly. The first difference, I think, is the approach to the use of evidence. How do you or your team approach using evidence? And the typical words used here are things like conscientious, explicit, judicious. But all that really means is you take it seriously. You take the use of data and information seriously and you focus on that. That's the first difference. So we always evidence, but we don't necessarily do it thoroughly or very seriously or treat it as that important. That's the first difference. The second difference is the use of multiple sources. So we've talked already about scientific evidence. We've mentioned organizational data. There are two sources, but also your own professional expertise is very important. What do you think is going on? What's the evidence from your experience? And again, how valid and reliable is that? But also, what about stakeholders? Stakeholders provide evidence. As you mentioned, you might talk to managers about, or using some feedback technique, they might look at it and go, I'm not going to do that. Now that's stakeholder feedback, stakeholder evidence. You could say, but it works. Sorry, it's not going to work if the managers won't do it. So that's evidence, data, information, feedback from stakeholders. It gives you a sense of not do that. So multiple sources is important, partly for triangulation. Are these different sources telling the same thing? But also for contextualization. So you may read a great academic article, you may read a great book about some technique that looks wonderful, but you need data from other sources, particularly your own organization, your own experience, your own stakeholders, to say, will that thing work here? So the second thing is multiple sources. The third thing is taking a kind of structured or stepped approach. We're full of biases, we're also very clever, but taking a structured approach, the idea is it helps us stay a bit more on track if we're trying to use evidence in everyday decisions. So those three differences, yes, we always use evidence, sure, everybody does, but I don't think it's typically doing those three things. Approach, multiple sources, structure. Yes, we always use evidence. So my experience, even at quite senior level decisions, is you might get a group of people in a room. Often the decision's being made even before people got in the room anyway, but they'll throw some stuff around. It's very political. It's very about, other goals, other targets. They'll make a decision and then they're done. And if you think about evidence-based practice, those elements were not in there. But yes, they were using evidence to some extent.
Yeah, and I think there's something here about commitment as well,
yeah.
which is in the approach, but it's commitment in the longevity of a project, because we can all buy in at the start, but what I notice is that if I run a program and we go, this is 12 to 18 months, then I really have to have a sit down with people and going, the biggest issue here isn't going to be the content, isn't going to be anything other than momentum, continuing motivation, because at first everybody will be excited and hey-ho. And even if people really enjoy coming and the feedback's great, actually the internal mechanisms of collecting data and keeping that going external to the workshops and the people that are on it, that'll be your challenge, because a lot of the work that I have done historically, I've put in for awards and things like that. And back in the day, you could just have some happy sheets and people saying it was awesome. Then, of course, it morphed to, no, you've got to really show that it's made a difference. So if you want to enter this for something, then to keep that going and that interest in validation and calibration, that will be hard work. Because the managers who are onto new things and have got their eye on the ball, or new chaos situations that are occurring, giving you that information internally, that's going to be hard work. So I think that's a big thing.
The commitment's a good word here, and I think it's a commitment not just a particular project, but I think as an individual practitioner or a team or a group or an organisation, it's a commitment to keeping on doing it.
Yeah.
And what we say to people is, look, this approach, you don't want to do it for every decision. Where should we have our virtual Christmas party? Or when should, you don't need to do an evidence-based practice approach for that. But when you're talking about something that's big and important for the organization, that potentially, do the organization's success or failure, or you're going to spend a lot of resources on it, then yeah, try this approach. But don't just try it once, try it the next time and the next time and the next time. And the idea is that going through this, back to your point about commitment, is people learn a lot more about the data they've got in the organization, their expertise as a practitioner, the scientific evidence, and even if they can get hold of it, and they will learn that every decision they make, there's big gaps in their knowledge. Now, you could say, oh, that's a kind of failure of this approach. I would say it shows the success of this approach in that we make decisions knowing what we know, how confident we are in that knowledge, but we also make decisions knowing what we don't know. So for next time, we're more likely to say, can we put things in place to make sure the next time we have this kind of big decision, we can more easily get access to the information we need, we can easily understand it, we can actually use it. Again, it's one thing to have data, evidence, information. It's nothing to be able to use it practically to help you make better decisions. They're rather different things. So yes, it is about commitment and a long-term thing. And for example, when I'm talking to organizational psychologists in particular, I often say to them, it's almost like a professional commitment. Is that how you want to practice, in this case, as an organizational work psychologist? Is that how you want to do it? Or do you want to practice by people saying, we need an assessment center, and you go, okay, I can do an assessment center, fine. There you go, have an assessment center. That's not particularly evidence-based. It's just doing a piece of work. It's following a technique and someone paid to do it. It's fine, but it's not evidence-based practice.
There's a couple of other things that came out of there for me. Number one is that balance of application, as in, but going to the Christmas party, don't overdo it. Understand when there's an intensity or a focus that's required. Now, just like when Audi build a very super car, it dribbles down into the lower vehicles. If you do start doing this on the big projects, it'll trickle down by the sounds of it. And it will affect probably the quality of what you're doing. And there's also something about reusing. I think I'm always saying we don't always have to start again. There should be a skill set that's growing. That means our route to application should be faster because we're getting better at doing it.
Exactly. So if you take organizational data, it may be, for example, most HR departments have access now, large companies, to huge amounts of data. If you ask an individual, can you pull out the data about this thing? It's like, yeah, I can, but I have to talk to this person. This database doesn't talk to that one. I need to contact the provider because we need to buy this module. And actually, I don't know how to do it, but this person does. But they're like, come on, we're never going to use it. It's too difficult. So exactly, learning the skills, building the resources. So we need to get this in order if we want to use it. And once we've done it once or twice or three times, it's more accessible, it's more usable. So indeed, it's about building the skills, the resources, the infrastructure, the capacity and capability to actually do that. And it's not a one-off thing. So I think it's, back to your word, I think it's a really good word, is about commitment. It's about, is that how you as an organization want to sort of do stuff? Not all the time, and that's fine, but is it a sort of commitment to sort of trying to make better informed decisions?
Now, my last kind of topic here before, because I said every time, there's nobody I have on these podcasts that I couldn't, over a weekend with a curry and a bottle of wine, I could keep you going for a couple of days. But trust is a big thing. Yes. And, we have all the indicators that say across the globe, trust in every place and space is reducing. And my analogy for that is when a doctor told me something was wrong with me 20 years ago, I believed them. Now I ask them to spell it, I Google it, and I see if I actually believe what they're saying. We're in a new place of trust or not, when we're seeing a lot of stuff in academic institutions, particularly in the US. We've got a few things that are drifting through into the UK now, with people being cancelled and this, that, and the other. And I think the belief or the validity in institutions that are kind of in this educational space, it's tenuous sometimes, and that slowly starts to infect whether or not people want to listen to people that are, inverted commas, experts or their trade. So I just wonder what your thoughts are around trust and being an expert. And I suppose, like every single trade, there's a spectrum of somebody that's top of their game through to somebody that probably shouldn't be in it. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
That's really interesting. It's a great question. I think personally, this sounds a bit odd. I'm trying to be less and less of an expert. And what I mean by that is, I think by becoming an expert, it always often is also a process that makes you very, very biased. If you're an expert, for example, in a particular statistical technique as a researcher, or if you're a practitioner in leadership development and you're really good at doing a particular thing, you worked really hard, you're going to want to keep doing that because you enjoy it, you think the clients enjoy it, and you've really committed and invested in that thing. If you find out it doesn't work, or if I find out the statistical technique doesn't work, or people are telling me it doesn't, I'm going to probably keep pushing at it for a while until someone says, no, you can't do that anymore, because it works, in inverted commas. It works for me, it works for my career, likewise with someone, say, doing management development. So I think expertise is a tricky one. And on the one hand, yes, we want to feel there are trusted sources, and it's clear there probably are, fairly clear, some sources are more trustworthy than others. Sure. Does it mean you can believe everything they say? No. And in particular, in the context of, I guess, academic research and scientific research has been something of I'm sure you're aware of it, a kind of crisis in various ways in terms of things like replications. And people who are on top of their game, not always, say in academia and scientists, are often the people who produce the most research, who are most heavily invested in a concept, who probably it will be very difficult for them to accept or admit or feel that concept isn't valid or worthwhile anymore because the whole career is based on it.
I've got 3 books on the topic and etc.
Yeah. So it's a sort of double-edged thing. And I think to me, expertise to me lies not necessarily in individuals. I think expertise probably lies more in institutions. So if you take the BBC, and that's kind of controversial, some areas of newspapers and other kinds of media, you could say, look, these are going to be more or less trustworthy. It's reasonable for me to trust, what this institution says.
On balance.
Yeah. But I think what's not ever reasonable is to trust what one person is telling you, even if they're an expert, you have to say what's behind that. Why are they saying it? Why are they motivated to make that claim? And I find it particularly so. My area of expertise is mostly around academia. And it is the case that people are huge experts in my field I'm aware of. I would say, I don't mean I wouldn't trust them. I just mean it is clear they're so into the things they're into that they probably are slightly blindsided. They can't see the limitations or weaknesses or questions that are in that. So someone actually recently, there's a paper published in Nature very recently saying that what science tends to encourage is not humility. And really what we need, back to your point about saying, I'm not too sure, I don't know. I think for anybody making decisions and using evidence, whether it's a scientist or a manager, I think having humility about what you know and don't know and being prepared to admit there are flaws and weaknesses is really important. But the scientific incentive structure actually encourages hubris, excessive pride, massive confidence. If you want to win grants, if you want to have huge research teams, you've got to really believe in what you're doing. That's great, but what are the costs of that? And I think that's a really interesting question. And again, I think it's not just scientists. Think about leadership, your field. There's a lot of people that get to leadership positions because they're uber confident. On the one hand, you say, well, isn't that, that's what you want. On the other hand, no, it is not what you want. So it's a real tension there between confidence, expertise, people who are prepared to do things, can get things done, but actually what cost is it? And what are they not doing? What are they ignoring to focus on what it is they want to do? And I think that's really difficult.
I'm fascinated by, and we'll have to come to a close in a minute, but I'm fascinated by bravery versus fallibility. And that recognition that I observe that everybody that's good at something is maybe it's not even bravery, maybe it's confidence. But there's an element of confidence, there's an element of bravery, there's an element of self-belief that there has to be. But sure. They're also balancing humility, their own fallibility, the recognition.
And doubt.
Yeah, their recognition that when somebody says, well, are you right? Well, it's the decision I've made is very different to, am I right? And I noticed this in people from the emergency services all the way to people making decisions in the boardroom. Is it the right thing to do? Well, in this moment in time, right now, with the decision,
given what we know,
about 5 minutes from now, we might go, bugger. It's not. But yes, if you can't turn back, we rebuke politicians for changing their mind.
Yeah.
Apparently it's wrong to go, oh no, I found out something new today and I've changed my mind. God forbid you should change your mind.
Yeah, exactly. What's wrong with the U-turn if the information and data and evidence changes? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So there's something then about when you are taking data, when you are looking at facts, of course it's presented to you with confidence, but then there is something about our emotional intelligence as human beings recognizing that people are fallible and they're presenting it in a manner that will be probably with good faith. But there are things that have been written that aren't now correct. We go a year later, we go, turns out not to be right. So I think there's something about the community I work in, which is taking things at the face value of it's new and it's shiny and it's in a book, and that not unwillingness to be a skeptic, but I think a crafted skeptic. It's I want it to be true. It probably is true, but I absolutely believe it might not be. and to hold that, I guess.
Yeah. And I think I'm rather in favour of skepticism, not cynicism, but skepticism, because I think it's that sort of constant question of, could that be wrong? What's wrong with that? Why is this person saying I'm not too sure? And it doesn't mean you can't still make decisions. Of course you can. Again, it's this issue of knowing how confident you are or not in the kind of issue, in the decision you're taking. I think craft is also very interesting because if you take certain kinds of crafts, again, if you're not into the craft, let's say something to do with DIY, something I know nothing or very little about. So it seems to me that people very good at that stuff have a really good basic set of tools. If you're not very good at it, you go to the shop, you go online, you buy a gadget, which kind of half does what you want, but it doesn't. It claims to not require skill, and of course, a lot of craft not only requires skill, it requires decent tools, but often very old tools, not particularly new, but it's that skill, that experience of using it. But what we're sold are the gadgets, and the same is true of cooking. So I know a bit more about cooking. Great example, do you need fancy gadgets for cooking? Absolutely not. But people who don't feel confident in cooking, who don't feel they can do it, they buy gadgets because it'll help. And I think exactly the same is true in management and in organizations. People buy the equivalent of gadgets. And actually probably taking a more craft sort of approach to it. Why do we need a new tool? What's the problem? What's the issue? Are our tools okay? Maybe we're just not very good at using them. Nothing wrong with these old tools. We're just not, or they need sharpening. Extend the analogy, like with a knife,
Sure.
Nothing with the knife, it's just not sharp enough, So why go out and buy a new knife or buy a chopper? This is another issue. What is wrong with the tool we've got? And I think that focus on newness. Again, I'm sure you've seen it dozens of times, but it's certainly in HR, again, my kind of areas of experience, is that focus on newness is extraordinary. People are always looking for new things, the latest thing. I always say to people, the newest and latest things are, by definition, the things for which there's the least evidence about their originalness. And also, a lot of the people issues we're dealing with are not new. Performance, motivation, well-being, these are ancient.
Yes. Marcus Aurelius probably said it a long time ago, right?
Exactly. But it's like we always want new, exciting stuff.
Yeah. I have a colleague, Miles Jowett, so shout out to Miles, and I said this many times on the podcast, but it always seems to be true, so maybe he should be doing the podcast. He's a musician, and he says there's no new notes.
Yeah.
And that's true, isn't it? There are no new notes. I haven't really seen anybody come up with anything that's fundamentally new. I've seen different presentation. I've seen a different way of offering it, which is not a bad thing because it can make it more palatable, more digestible, more etc. But ultimately, there's very little that is per se. The thing I'm seeing is it's a hack, leadership hack. I go, well, then when you say leadership hack, you mean no craft, no skill. It's a shortcut. You don't have to be good at it. Let me know how that works out for you.
And what's interesting is you would hope this is exactly the kind of thing that doesn't happen in science, but it is exactly the thing that happens in science. So people come along with a new construct and go, it's this new exciting thing, and it predicts everything about workplace behaviour. And then I give it a few years and people say, you know what, we've looked at it, we've compared it with existing constructs, and it's kind of no different from the big five, or it's no different from this existing concept. But again, it comes back to what are we rewarded for? If we're rewarded for novelty for no reason, then people try and invent new stuff that isn't new stuff. And it's just, I suppose sometimes I think it's just, as it is in science, it's a huge distraction. It's a huge distraction. What it means is people are not drilling down into important concepts. They're constantly trying to come up with new ideas because that's what they get rewarded for. And I think it's true in many areas of other areas of practice as well, actually.
So listen, respecting your time, anything from you, Rob, that you think, do you know what, if somebody was interested in this space and wanted to understand more, this is the book they should read, or the podcast that they should look at, or the website that they should review? Any just kind of gifts to the audience that you think, hey?
Yeah, so if you Google the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, www.sedma.org, you'll find a lot of resources there, including lots of videos, teaching materials, training materials, papers, presentations, and also a book was produced by the Centre, which came out about 5 years ago about evidence-based management. And if you're interested in particular watching, it's one of my fascinations at the beginning, watching people discussing evidence and what it tells or doesn't tell. Sometimes it get quite satisfying for me, conversations going on LinkedIn and Twitter. So you could follow me on that. And there's other people you can self-follow who kind of enjoy that same process as well.
Well, I'll put your link in the description. I've picked up on a couple of things around AI and things like that you've been sort of commenting on. Again, I could just go on and on and on, but maybe there'll be a part two. So listen, from me to you, I just want to say, stay on the line just for a few moments with me to make sure it's all worked. But thank you for me. This has been a great conversation. I've trusted it and it's felt very easy and real. And I think it will be great value for people as well. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks, guys. Great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
That's it. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please share so others get to hear about us, and subscribe so you keep up to date on new episodes. Also visit livingbrave.com if you want to connect with me and find out more about executive coaching, team effectiveness, and changing culture. Oh, and of course you can buy my book Living Brave Leadership on Amazon. So on that note, see you soon.